Ready? Good evening, everyone here, and good morning or afternoon or midnight or whatever, anywhere else on Zoom. My name is Brantly Womack, and some of you have known me already. But my first job tonight is to introduce our moderator and question asker, because Professor Amitav Acharya is from American University. And so I'm in the sort of odd position of introducing the moderator before going on to the lecture. And Amitav holds the UNESCO Chair of Transnational Challenges and Governance at American University, as well as being a distinguished professor in the School of International Service. Oh, just a second. If my glasses fog too much, I won't be able to read this. He's the first non-Western scholar to be elected president of the International Studies Association. He's a citizen of Canada, but he's taught everywhere: Beijing, South Africa, UK, Canada. He is a citizen of the world, and he lives up to that responsibility in his writings. His books include The Making of Global International Relations with Barry Buzan, and I'd like to recommend, if you want a really good critical introduction to the development of international relations theory since 1919, this is the book to start with. And then Constructing Global Order is another recent book. And then The End of American World Order is in its second edition, and a very good book on the first edition and improved in the second. And tomorrow, he will present ideas from his forthcoming book, which is Demons and Angels: Can Asia Survive the Return of Geopolitics? At a lunch forum sponsored by the East Asia Center's Belt and Road Initiative Research Program. And it's probably too late to sign up for lunch, and some of you may not be awake at lunchtime tomorrow. But in any case, it's also on Zoom, and you can get the Zoom address off of the East Asia Center website. Two big reasons why I am happy and honored to have Amitav involved in this program are, first of all, that he's the leading Western scholar taking Southeast Asia seriously in its own terms. And that is a rare thing and something that merits great attention, and he deserves the praise for what he's done already and what he will continue to be doing. The second thing is that he's a pioneer in assessing the significance of the change of the American world order to something beyond. And of course, both of these things, Southeast Asia is part of Pacific Asia, and what comes beyond the American world order are major themes of our talks, of which this is number 4. Now, he calls this new order the multiplex order, and I call it the multinodal order. But clearly, we're marching in the same direction. Okay, and Amitav will be, after my lecture, Amitav will be introducing Evelyn Goh, our discussant for tonight, and then managing the questions. So, a hearty welcome back to those intrepid souls who have trekked through the first 3 lectures on the recentering of Pacific Asia, and a welcome also to those just joining us now. For those of us outside Pacific Asia, tonight's discussion is of greatest immediate interest because we are finally addressing the question, what does all this mean for the rest of us? A graph is worth 1,000 numbers. So let's start by looking at this graph. What we can see here, and I have to thank our old friend Angus for the numbers here. Angus Madison, who featured in his discussion with the Jiaqing Emperor earlier, is back because he provides estimates of world productivity from AD 1 to the present and beyond the present. So if we look at this, this is a map of the center of gravity, the changing economic center of gravity in the world. And not much movement there from AD 1 to 1500. A little bit more movement from 1500 to 1820, when you have China's population explosion, but not a productivity explosion, and the beginning of a productivity rise in Europe. Then 1820 to 1913, look at that shift toward the West here. And that shift is obviously driven by two things, primarily industrialization with its new sources of energy, as well as organization of production, and colonization, because to some extent, the success of the West was built on the backs of its colonies. Then 1913, you have a little bit of a change of pace, 1913 to 1940, and then an increase as the United States economy becomes greater. And then you have the beginning of a shift with the growth of the Japanese economy and the re-emergence of the Pacific Rim economies to a more serious move to 1990. And think of that period as a Japanese period for major change. And then a little bit more move, but remember, that's only 10 years. And then a great move between 2000, 2010, which Angus thinks will continue in that direction till 2025. And certainly so far, the dotted lines have been filled in. So think about what this means. This is a big change. The divergence has occurred. As I pointed out when we were talking about Angus Madison the first time, in 1820, China's share in the global GDP was 1/3. All Asia was 60% of the global production. When it comes to, then comes colonialism in full industry. By 1952, China was 5% of global production, Asia 17%, EU and the US together were 57%. Okay, same basic situation in 1978, China still 5% in 1978 on the eve of the reform and openness. But by 2003, 15 years later, China is 15% of global production. EU, US is 40%. And if we look ahead at these estimates and these projections, China's 23%, EU and US is 30%. So we're having a phenomenal move in the rise of China that can be seen in the data. But China is not, the change here is much bigger than China. Since the year 2000, the production of Pacific Asia, East Asia plus Southeast Asia, has been greater than that of the United States. And last year, Pacific Asia production would equal that of the United States and the EU combined. So we're talking about a region whose overall economic productivity is larger than what we normally think of as the major economies of the world. And China is 57% of that total, which is why, in a couple of numbers, China's recentering of Pacific Asia matters to the rest of us, because we all live on this world that is changing so much in its proportions. But there is even a bigger story here than Pacific Asia. The West and the rest, developed countries and developing countries, the rest catch up to the West in 2008. If you look at total productivity of developing countries versus total productivity of developed countries worldwide, 2008 is a historic moment. Why historic? Because this hasn't happened since the 19th century. What we have here is a convergence of developing and developed worlds, not displacement, because the developing world is getting to this high point of productivity in part because of population. Okay, so it's not simply catching up and about to surpass, certainly not in wealth. There's this big change in the global proportions of production and change in population. Like global warming, the underlying process of global reconfiguration is gradual, and it can pass unnoticed year by year. Like global warming, the change matters, whether noticed or not. And like global warming, its momentum can spawn crises. Is this development that we've talked about, this big turnaround in the center of gravity of the world economy. Is this inevitable? Yes, it's already happened. And if we look at the reasons for it happening, those reasons are likely to continue. So it's likely to go in this direction for a while yet, unless something worse happens. Of course, if we have thermonuclear war, then something else would have happened and this whole projection would certainly be meaningless. But that's hardly a real alternative that we'd want to consider. So what we'll be doing today is going through a lecture in 5 parts. First, we'll briefly consider the significance of the rise of the West, since this puts our focus on Pacific Asia in a broader framework. As long as we're looking at Pacific Asia from the outside, we have to consider the outside of which Pacific Asia is a part. And that's this rise of the West that I've described. Then we'll discuss the implications of what I call the multinodal world order, or what Amitav might call the multiplex world order. And I date that from 2008. Third, we'll go back to Pacific Asia, but we'll concentrate on putting Pacific Asia in a global context. Fourth, we will address the global rivalry between the United States and China. And in conclusion, we'll consider the challenges of multinodal global leadership. So with all that to do, let's get started. First of all, the rise of the West. And this is something that I don't think people expected until it happened, but look at the ironies of having been left behind in the period of Western modernization. What the rest have was the directional ease of a path well trodden. Things had been accomplished that the developing world wanted to accomplish themselves, had been accomplished elsewhere. That didn't mean that they had the capital. They mean that they had to develop the capital, had to provide direction, had to provide the context, but they knew where they were going because people had been there before. Secondly, the greater priority and scale of production over invention and innovation. If you have if the products are out there already that you want to produce, then the question is scale and efficiency of production. If you are at the edge of technology, then invention, innovation are more salient. Third, the priority of development. If you're behind in development, behind other countries in development, you see this relative deprivation of where you are, then the obtainability comes before sustainability. If you don't have it, you can't sustain it. And so your interest in sustainability is less. Another thing is that the rest is still the periphery, but of a decentered world. The world is is basically, as I'm sure Amitav would agree, is post-hegemonic. The world is a different place, but the rest is still the periphery of that world. The United States is still the central power in this world and central economy and security. So the last point is convergence, but not catch-up. As the developing world passes the developed world in aggregate productivity, it has a long way to go, and it will not reach this point in this century, probably, when its per capita productivity reaches the level of the West. So it's a different type of question we have here for these developing countries. We have a question of the emergence of demographic power. And what is demographic power? It's the rise of the West equaling in equal share the increase in relative population and decrease in the per capita gap. That is, their larger populations matter because the level of production in the countries has gone up. The rest are now 86% of global population, 27% of per capita. In 1980, they were 79% of population and 15% of per capita. So those are the differences it made. So what else is involved in this new demographic power, of which China is the avatar, but by no means the only example? First of all, you have lower per capita income. So upscaling is a big problem for developing countries. How do you move from being a low wage producer to something, as you raise your wages, presumably, make your population happy, what happens to that low wage advantage? And can it be taken by other countries who have also entered the global market? So the problem known as the middle income trap is a serious and general problem. And I'd say it's more challenging for smaller countries, because for smaller countries, they cannot as efficiently protect their domestic markets or develop the scale of domestic markets that can be the primary target of advanced production. China's lucky in that regard. You have a greater extent and a higher urgency of government services. And this is exacerbated by aging populations. And the world population is aging, as well as almost every country's population. Proportionally, in a developing country, you have less discretionary government expenditure because there's just not that much wealth in the country that can be concentrated. Of course, you can decide to concentrate your wealth on military or whatever. And if you have as big a scale advantage like China does, if you're big, you have, even though you're concentrating as proportionally smaller from a larger population, but smaller GDP per capita, you still are getting quite a bit in Beijing that you can develop, that you can use to develop a space program or whatever. So scale advantage counts with demography. So what is the rise of the West? How does China relate to this? The first thing I'd point out is that China relates as an alternative to the rest, an alternative model, alternative funder, alternative in many senses, but not exclusive. Like Japan in 1905, China is an encouraging example of the success of a latecomer. And if you're Nigeria or Ethiopia, that encouraging example is important. For Africa and Latin America, it is a new alternative partner. And not only is it the option of Chinese investment or Chinese cooperation important, but it also gives you, the existence of that option gives you more leverage with traditional partners in Europe and the United States. For closer countries, however, for the neighbors, there's worries about the increasing asymmetry in the relationship. If you're Kenya, it doesn't matter so much because you're pretty far away from China. If you're Vietnam or Philippines, it matters much more. Does China have too much leverage? Will China remain inclusive in its global development? This is very important for its neighbors especially. So now on to a multinodal world. Multinodal, not multipolar. Microsoft Word, I hope you are listening. Now, Amitav has a better time with multiplex because Microsoft Word has been to the movies, so it doesn't automatically adjust that. But multinodal, check it if you ever use the word for Microsoft Word, correcting it to multimodal. So why multinodal? Well, it's not just, the world is not multipolar because it's not just two levels of the pole club and the rest. It's not a group of countries or one country in a unipolar system that has all the agency and everyone else is a passive recipient. There's no country or group of poles that's in charge with everyone else being passive. And the web of relationships that this creates is uncertain and it's very inactive, but I mean, it's very interactive, but it's not chaotic. Well, let's put it this way. It's to the interest of every country involved to minimize the chaos in their own relationships. And so what you have developing is a matrix of asymmetry. You have nodes of different sizes and locations, different countries having different levels of attention from other countries because those countries have different levels of exposure to them. Okay, and the fact that they're in different locations matters too. I mentioned Kenya versus Philippines, for instance. That where you are in the matrix makes a difference. Okay. Also, I'd like to point out that a multinodal world is not a balance of power world because it is post-hegemonic. And balance of power is essentially a way of either getting to the top of the heap or preventing others from getting to the top of the heap, or trying to live in a world where no one's quite yet at the top of the heap, but that's your biggest problem, is keeping them from getting there. Well, this is beyond European great power games. There is mutually assured destruction in decisive nuclear war. You know, nobody wins in that. There's just, with nuclear war, there's a heap, you know, there's a hole rather than a heap, and you don't want to be in any place close to it. There's the frustration of asymmetric, endless small wars. So even having a greater power, even being the larger power in a bilateral relationship, doesn't mean that you get to that your preferences will succeed. And I hardly necessary to mention Afghanistan, but consider it mentioned. And not only that, but you have a situation of, because it's a web of relationships, it's hard to deal with a bilateral relationship in a way that doesn't negatively affect other relationships that are important to you. So what you have in this post-hegemonic multinodal world is influence that relates to power, but not domination, not the ability to execute your unilateral wishes in international relations. And if you can try, but you can also have failures if you try. Power still matters, but it can't dominate. Asymmetric exposure is there. And Cambodia is more exposed to Vietnam than Vietnam is exposed to Cambodia. But both are embedded in a web of relationships. And both are likely to use, instead of siding with one side, as you have in balance of power, or siding with the other, instead of alliances with one or the other, you typically have hedging, that is protecting yourself against adverse turns in the relationship, and buffering, that is protecting yourself against dependency in the relationship by developing other relationships. And those are more typical features of a post-hegemonic international relations world. So partnerships fit this better than alliances, because in a partnership, you maximize reliable contact. You have open-ended and non-exclusive relationships. You can have a partnership with China and another partnership with the United States or with anyone else. By each of those partnerships is securing your relationship with the country you're a partner of. And it's not against another country the way an alliance tends to be. And I would argue that US alliances have become really, in effect, heritage alliances. And if you look at the Quad discussions that have occurred in the last month, I think you can see that happening. Do alliances count? Ask France about the Quad. Do alliances bind participants to the will of the dominant partner? Ask India if that's what they intended by joining the Quad. So the situation actually is much more complicated than the current discussion in the United States of alliances would suggest. And all of this implies that there's not just bilateral partnerships, but the importance of partial and regional groupings. These are, you can look at these, look at something like ASEAN as a coordinated partnership in this sense. It doesn't exclude relations with other countries. And ASEAN certainly has promoted relations with everybody else. So what about Pacific Asia as a new central region? And by center, remember, I don't mean a power center. I certainly don't mean a hegemonic center. Well, Pacific Asia, as a percentage of the rest of the world, I just want to point out two numbers here. First of all, in 2001, the United States economy was 67% of the economies of the rest of the world minus Pacific Asia and the United States. So it's 2/3 of the rest of the world's economy. 2020, Pacific Asia is equal to 2/3 of the rest of the world economy. So that's the type of change we're talking about. This is why everybody, not just Asians, have to take Pacific Asia carefully. And Pacific Asia has a tremendous amount of economic cohesiveness. Trade, China is the largest trading partner of all neighbors. Global value chains, now what are those? Those are trade and intermediate parts to a final assembly somewhere and final sale. Intra-Pacific Asia was 80% of its total global value chain trade. So most of that multi-part construction, which is much more integrated than simply I make a product and sell it to you. This global value chain, which is 2/3 of world trade, is occurring within Pacific Asia. And China is the top supplier and user of the Pacific Asia intermediate products. As far as investment goes, intra-Pacific Asia is 50% of the total. China is not the main partner in this regard. This would be Japan, Korea, Hong Kong. But China's investment in Pacific Asia has gone up 20 times since 2005. What are the centrality challenges of Pacific Asia? The challenges for China. First of all, China's ambiguous identity. Its general problem of respecting diversity in domestic politics and outside. Then the greater challenge, the challenge of Greater China. 4 successful autonomous political communities. How are these going to be handled? And how do these relate individually as well as in some respects as Greater China to the rest of the region and to the outside world? And then the special tensions of the Taiwan Straits and the sovereignty disputes in South China Sea that we discussed last time, and the ambiguous global ambitions of China. So what about China's ambiguous centrality in Pacific Asia? Certainly it's in the middle, but is it pursuing warm, peaceful development or cold? Is it trying to cooperate and lead on common interests as the win-win formula suggests? Or is it basically using its predominance of capacity to get the maximum benefit for itself? And obviously the reality is liable to be somewhere in between. But to the extent that it gets cold, the region has reason to not just buffer against China, but also hedge against China. So another thing that people worry about is, are we having a return to a chessboard of global rivalry? If you're in Southeast Asia, you do not want to go back to the situation of the 1960s when you're worried, when everybody in Southeast Asia is worried because they're the venue of much more powerful forces and decisions. That's what led to the foundation of ASEAN in 1967. Then you have dual inclusiveness as an absolutely fundamental thing for the acceptance of China as a central power in Asia. There can't be any regional fences, and China has to serve as a center of the region's global centrality, not as a black hole in the middle of the region that simply attracts things to itself. Belt and Road Initiative has to be a road out as well as a road in. The last centrality challenge is that Pacific Asia as a multinodal microcosm is not a happy family, even within ASEAN. So the question is, people living together and people living and countries living in ways that their autonomy is enhanced rather than diminished. And another concern is maintaining ASEAN's regional momentum. ASEAN has been a leader, a political leader in new inclusive arrangements in Pacific Asia and beyond. And it's worried about losing that leadership role. And lastly, managing misperceptions, because countries are not likely to adopt China's point of view. China is not likely to adopt their point of view, but the management of misperceptions, the successful management and control and reduction of the possibility of misperceptions leading to disasters is important to that centrality challenge. Now, the last thing I'd like to concentrate on a bit is China and Japan's relation as the key relationship. And I'm sure Evelyn will have some comments on this, since she's just published an excellent book on China-Japan relations and what the options are. And Japan, you know, is an honorary Westerner, but it's interwoven into Pacific Asia. So it's, you might say it sits as neither one or the other, or different parts of it are of different segments. But it's not only allied with the United States, it's in a situation vis-a-vis China, very much like the US situation. It has status nostalgia versus American hegemonic nostalgia. And Japan was not in charge of Pacific Asia 20 years ago, but it was the country that people could admire for its development, and a country that led in economic development in the region. So to see the change, to see China's emergence is certainly a problem for Japan's idea of itself. And developed country defensiveness is another characteristic for Japan. That is, like Germany, like the EU, like the United States, Japan can see this rise of the rest. It can view this as something from a fairly cold standpoint, because they're the West that the rest are rising toward. They don't have the enthusiasm for that Nigeria might have. And the question is, how do we preserve what we have? How do we sustain the privileges of divergence that have accumulated over the last 500 years for the West in general, and for Japan over the last 150 years? With those problems that Japan has in mind, I still think it's important to note that it's up to China to respect Japan. And the shoe is on China's foot as far as improving the relationship goes. And perhaps Evelyn will have something to say about that, because in her book with Barry Buzan, they talk about this possibility of a China-Japan condominium. Okay, so global power rivalry. Now this is where most discussions of China, first of all, and of US-China relations would start. But what we've talked about so far provides context that makes this much more realistic. So global power rivalries, certainly the US and China are center court. They're both national actors together with 1/3 of the world economy. And they're the only two global powers. Each is larger than the next three combined in economic size. But they're in a multinodal world in which power, which they have, matters, but no unilateral domination is possible. To the extent that they try to dominate unilaterally, they will find the limits of their power. And the more hostile the bilateral relationship between the United States and China is, the more reason the others will have to work around center court rather than choosing sides. And I want to emphasize this point, because one of the new characteristics of this multinodal world is a diffusion of agency, a diffusion of the alternatives that every country has in choosing partners, in developing commerce, developing whatever they want to develop. And this is something we lose sight of in the United States, and I'd say also in China, because we see countries looking at us, we don't see how they're looking at their neighbors. This global power rivalry is an asymmetric parity. Each, the United States and China, can hurt the other, but they are each in very different situations. They're in different locations and they have different capacities. I won't go into the details because we don't have time, but you can imagine what some of those differences would be. 14 land neighbors for China. The difference in in per capita and 1/4 American per capita productivity, but surpassing American aggregate productivity. So all of these things affect the nature of the rivalry between the two. It's a long-term rivalry. It's not victory or defeat. Try to imagine what China defeating the United States would mean. Try to imagine what the United States defeating China would mean. If you can come up with a plausible scenario for either of those, I'll be quite impressed. So, long-term rivalry. If it's a long-term rivalry, and if one is not trying to defeat the other, or defeat and victory are not the ultimate strategic gains, then absolute gain, that is the progress the United States makes, is more important than its relative gain vis-a-vis China. And for China, the same thing. Absolute gain, absolute development, and development of relationships as well as economic developments are more important than relative gain versus the United States. Another aspect is that China is primarily regional and the US is primarily global. How China relates to Pacific Asia is its major challenge. And the China-Japan relationship is the most obvious challenge within the international relationships. And if China doesn't do well, and if it doesn't add political acceptance and credibility to its economic centrality that it has established, then China will be self-limiting, and the region will be self-limiting. The region will back off from China, individually and collectively. Any examples of that? Well, look at India with terrible relationships with the other countries of South Asia, or look at Russia and its relationship to its near abroad. In both cases, India's international role, Russia's international role are limited and distorted by the fact that they don't have their relationships with their neighbors in order. How the US relates to the world is its major challenge because we are primarily a global power. Right, relating to the world is not just organizing allies against China. Relating to the world means global leadership. Two military dangers in this global power rivalry. First of all, militarization of either one or both, a la Soviet Union. I'm really worried about this, just the news the last 2 days on naval strategies and various other things. The securitization of American politics in an anti-China way, not just anti-China, bracket whether China deserves that. Look at the scale of investment and resources that have no further positive effects on the rest of welfare and the rest of society. Militarization in China, not to the same scale, even as a proportion of GDP, but still a serious problem. And then last military danger is escalation of confrontations. It's nice to think that nobody in their right mind would pursue a war situation between the United States and China. Does that mean it can't happen? Unfortunately not, because confrontations can grow out of crises can produce escalation that leads to confrontations that neither side in hindsight would want. So what's desirable? Mutual risk reduction. When risk is mutual, controlling the mutual exposure to that risk should be the strategic goal. Whether that's controlling risk of war or nuclear war, controlling cyber risk, controlling space risk. Not enough thought in this. Risk reduction is not simply being the most powerful in maintaining that status. It's reaching agreements. Of course, mutual agreement it does have risk, but it's less risky than a race to outclever the other in technologies that can be destructive. And all of this is a broader problem than a G2 question, than a relationship with the United States and China. It's multilateral or even global risk control regimes are necessary. So what's global leadership in a multinodal world? Our final topic. Different from who's on top because there isn't a top. This is what Evelyn Goh has called an order transition, not a power transition. And in international relations theory, that's a very good point to make. Power transition is the Thucydides trap. To give a recent example, that an incumbent power facing a rising power has to fight, it gets obsessed with the rising power and preventing its rise, leading to war. So an order transition is not necessarily a power transition in a post-hegemonic environment. Cooperation is essential, and cooperation requires respect. And respect is something that's in short supply in the US-China relationship. Both sides face problems of tolerance of diversity. The US challenge is diversity of systems. China's challenge is diversity below systems. And lastly, inclusive global governance is not simply a question of adding China. It's not simply a G2 question. But on the other hand, global reconstitution is unlikely. All progress in regional and specific regimes, therefore, should be welcome. So, thank you. And you may notice a familiar figure over there. And now, Amitav will introduce Evelyn. I will stop this
share. Thank you, Brantly, for introducing me and also my family. On top of, do you know where that was? It's the most sacred place for, at least for the Koreans, the Changbai Mountain. That's where Kim Jong-un plans his strategy of world domination. So he rides a white horse and goes to Changbai Mountain, which is a very sacred place for Koreans. And then he decides what to do next in terms of which missile to fire, which how to blackmail the United States. It's very, very sacred to Koreans. And I'm very glad that I met Brantly for the first time in that area. Of course, first time was in Changchun in Jilin province. We were at a conference, but really got to know each other on top of a mountain, which actually is a very nice way to build a relationship. So thank you for that. And thank you for your very kind words. The beginning of the talk. Actually, that's very Asian. When I used to work in Singapore, and Evelyn will probably remember that because we used to work together. First, you have a MC. The MC then introduces the moderator or the chair, and the chair then introduces the speaker. So there is an Asian tradition of doing that. But thank you very much. And also thank you for inviting me and Dorothy for getting me all the way from Washington, DC, from the other end of the world. So I'm very happy to be here. It's a kind of mildly historic occasion for me because this is the first time since March 2020 that I have, I'm in actually in person in a lecture theater, which is not a classroom. I have been teaching, my university has reopened face-to-face teaching. So I've been teaching for the last 4 weeks to my students, but I've never attended a seminar or a conference or a workshop in person because that's still prohibited in my university. So this is a historic occasion after a long break. Anyway, my job is very simple. We have had the first part of the event today. So that is the most important part, the speech by the talk by Professor Womack, and also it is, as you know, he has been introduced, so I don't need to introduce him, but it's part of his very ambitious, very timely book project. But my job is to introduce, actually the most important person today is not Brantly or me, it's the discussant who actually comes from the other end of the world. You can't be any further than from Canberra, from here, so down under, as they say. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Professor Evelyn Goh, who I know as a friend and also as a colleague for at least 3 years. In Singapore, we were colleagues at the what is now called the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, where I spent about 7 years as the deputy director and head of research. And Evelyn spent part of her career there. But she has a very distinguished background. She, of course, was educated in Oxford and taught there at Oxford, taught in Singapore, and then University of London, before she went to Australian National University in Canberra, where I also spent a fair bit of time, but as a student. I was a student in Australia, and my very first research fellowship was in same center where she is, Strategic and Defense Studies Center, where I had the privilege of working with the late Professor Desmond Ball. So our paths crossed. In fact, I was on a Zoom meeting with her just 3 weeks ago. So it is my great pleasure to introduce her as the discussant, and just briefly about her work. You know, one of the books that she has co-edited, co-authored with Professor Barry Bujan on China-Japan Relations is the most recent one, 2020. But she also has 2 major earlier books, self-authored books, one on constructing the US-China relationship with Cambridge. And then, of course, the most well-known work of her is, I associate with the concept order transition instead of power transition. She talks about order transition, and the title is Struggle for Order. So if you are interested in Asia-Pacific security, now people call it Indo-Pacific, you must read that book, because it provides the kind of a narrative of transition in order, not transition. You know, we hear too much in IR theory about power transition, but very little about transition in order. And that is, of course, a very, very important book in Asia-Pacific security. There are many other things that she has done, or she's doing, but at the moment, she is the co-editor, managing editor of probably the most important series in international relations theory, book series in international relations theory, the Cambridge series of international relations. She is the co-managing editor. So if you have a book manuscript, want to get it published in a very prestigious series, that's the one to go. And she also sits in very prestigious journal editorial boards like International Security, for example. But I don't want to take any more time from her comments. So I will now invite her to speak for about 15 minutes. And then we will move to the last part of the event, which is question and answer, which will be both in person from those who are in the room, but also by Zoom using the Q&A function, which I will moderate. So Evelyn, you are on.
Thank you very much, Amitav, for that very, very kind introduction. And good evening, afternoon, morning to you all, wherever you are, but particularly good evening, Professor Brantly Womack and the live audience at UVA. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm joining you from Australia, and we are in lockdown. So the best I can do is to give you this lovely background picture of the iconic university house in the Australian National University. Look, thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this final lecture in this series by one of my favorite original minds and one of my favorite scholars of East Asia. I have for a long time admired Professor Womack's work on the structures, the politics, and the practices of asymmetry in international relations, and also his book, particularly on China and Vietnam. More recently, I found his 2014 and 2016 articles on China in the future multinodal order and US-China asymmetric parity to be some of the most stimulating reads in the literature on futures thinking regarding the region. So thank you, Brantly, for those incredibly important works. Although we clearly have many mutual friends, including the inimitable Amitav Acharya, with whom I'm really happy to be sharing a virtual stage again with today. Quite remarkably, Brantly and I only met in person for the first time a few years ago. I think, Brantly, that it was at the ISA either in San Francisco or in Toronto. I still recall our fascinating discussion then, which left me a great deal to chew over for quite a long time afterwards. Now, in my task as discussant today, I am deeply aware that I follow in the most distinguished footsteps of Professors Wang Gangwu, Wu Yushan, and Qin Yaqing. So all I can say is I'll try to do my best here. Now, over the past 3 weeks, Brantly Womack has provided us with a hugely stimulating tour of the horizon of China's pre-modern centrality, its decentered modernity, and what we might think of as the recentering process within what we might think of as its post-modernity. Now, in the process, Professor Womack has used a set of lenses that has widened with each lecture, from the initial quite cynic focus out towards a wider look at East Asian encounters with modernity in the second lecture, and then in the third lecture at how China's resurgence in the global political economy and in international relations has facilitated the wider East Asian region's recentering in global affairs. Now, in this fourth and final lecture, which you've just heard, he draws these strands together and looks towards the future in some ways, making a series of remarkably important points about the characteristics of the current and coming order that East Asia is heading towards, and how China's power, positioning, and production in this future order will pan out. Now, in so doing, Professor Womack has presented an array of deeply insightful and sometimes also quite provocative observations. So I'd like to rise to the bait and provide reactions to some of the most important propositions that he has made this evening in this lecture. Let me begin by congratulating Professor Womack again for his multinodal framework. Brantly, I think this is such an important concept, which really deserves the fleshing out and the attention that hopefully this lecture series allows you to leverage. I think there is quite a significant difference between your multinodal framework and other frameworks that you've alluded to, such as Amitav Acharya's multiplex idea and some other notions that are well known in the literature. To my mind, your derivation of this idea of nodality relates, of course, to ideas of systems. And for me, the value of your idea of there being multiple nodes in the international system is that the idea of nodes gives us that sense that there are important junctures in the international system where multiple cross-cutting flows intersect, and that these nodes wield authority because they are the control centers of connectivity, right? And that's what I find immensely valuable about your framework that isn't there in other frameworks that we've got in the literature today. So this notion for me is functional and structural at the same time, right? It emphasizes diffusion and networks of authority and networks of relationships, but at the same time, it acknowledges that power remains important and there are power differentials still in these multiple nodes in the system. Except that the power operates via different modes and different needs, right? So what we do have certainly is a diffusion and a fragmentation away from a single core or a single center or a single hegemon, certainly. But we're not yet moving into a world that has no great powers at all, right? Or no centers at all, right? And we're not there yet. And the reason I like your multinodal sort of idea partly is because it gels with how I've always tried to, in recent years, characterize what's going on in our region. And, you know, I often use the phrase that what we've got is a region that now has more actors, more factors, and more vectors, right? To give a sense of what I call the messy pluralization of the regional order. And, you know, I don't use the nodal sort of idea, but when I've had to teach this, I often show a slide of, you know, a single pillared house, like resting on one pillar. And then a second slide of a more traditional house on stilts that we find very often in Southeast Asia, for example. And for me, that characterizes the transition. We're moving into an order that rests on multiple stilts, not just the single pillar. So I think that's quite a close corollary to what you've been describing within your multinodal framework. Now, you know, you've alluded to my idea of order transition. And, you know, I think as we're undergoing this transition, which involves significant alterations in common goals and values, rules of the game, social structures of the regional international society particularly, it's really, really important how we imagine the new order to look like, right? Because how we imagine this new order to look like will shape how and with whom we're willing to negotiate and to fight, and what we want to negotiate and fight for. So in this context, I think, you know, Brantly Womack's multinodal world is one that is attractively pluralist, right? It offers potential agency for different actors and different combinations of actors, while still remaining quite comforting in an odd sort of way by acknowledging that there will remain some hubs, some spokes, right, in this system. I feel that this is a vision that most pragmatic Asians can live with, right? And perhaps even negotiate and fight for. Let me move to a second observation, which I think, you know, may help to put also some of the big picture points in context here. And this relates perhaps to what Professor Wu Yushan spoke about in the second lecture. Professor Wu very usefully reminded us about the earlier period of confused modernization experienced in China and East Asia, and how that was fundamental to understanding China's decentering, right, in the international system at the time. Professor Wu argued that, you know, China's centrality and decentralizing was determined by China's choice of political, economic, institutional paths, right, that allowed or did not allow rise in productivity and growth of the Chinese economy. Now, I'd say that despite the incredible successes of China's post-totalitarian authoritarian modernization since the 1980s, this institutional route is still ongoing. It's still a fairly unforged path, right? The political economist Yuan Ang recently very usefully drew the analogy between the US's Gilded Age around 1870 to 1900 and contemporary China, right? She argues, quote, that whereas the American progressive era relied on democratic measures to fight crony capitalism, President Xi Jinping's attempt currently is to summon China's own progressive era through command and control, right? The world, she notes, has yet to witness a government successfully overcome the side effects of capitalism by decree, end of quote. Right. So what I'm trying to say here is that China's modernization challenge is still going on with uncertain results. So a lot of what we're projecting about the contemporary order and what we might project for future order in the region assumes the continued success of China's current, you know, authoritarian capitalist modernization path. This, of course, is an assumption. Mind you, just as much of an assumption in these projections that we do is that there will be, continued US domestic stability and foreign policy, foreign strategic capability coming out of the United States. This, of course, is as well an assumption and a point that I feel is fairly important to stress, particularly when we think about the claims that Professor Womack quite rightly makes, when discussing East Asian strategic choices and strategic behavior, right, characterized by what many call hedging. And it really is in that context of continued uncertainty, not just vis-a-vis China, but also vis-a-vis the United States, that these strategies make sense. Let me move to the other large element in Professor Womack's talk about the big picture shift in the world economy within which we need to situate much of what he's talking about within the Asian context. I certainly agree with the emphasis on production when thinking about the large shift in the world's center of economic gravity eastward, back towards the Asian continent. However, I think the picture becomes even more, or the trajectory becomes even more compelling if we also think about the other side of the economic balance, which is consumption, right? And if we think about consumption patterns, it's become evident that producers, both in developing and developed countries, have loosened their previous dependence on demand from developed markets and are increasingly pivoting towards a profile of meeting demand in developing countries that is extremely significant indeed. In quite an important study that came out first in 2010 and then was updated in 2017, it was projected that by last year, the global middle class, right, the middle classes being the rising proportion of consumers in the international economy, will constitute a majority of the global population, right? And in what is the most rapid expansion of the middle class the world has ever seen, almost 90% of the next billion entrants into the global middle class will be in Asia, right? We're talking about 380 million Indians, 350 million Chinese, and 210 million other Asians. Now, put quite simply, what the consumption side of the equation shows is that the wealth of nations no longer primarily depends on Western consumption, right? This really reinforces the point about that recentering towards Asia that Professor Womack's quite compellingly already put ahead of us. Now, in that context, I want to make an observation about China and Professor Womack's intriguing claim of China's imperatives still being primarily regional, while the US imperatives remain primarily global. I think I've tried this too before, and I've come to the conclusion that this dichotomy may not be terribly useful. I'm not sure that we can have it both ways, right? I'm not sure that we can claim that the world economy certainly is recentering towards Asia through China's rise, and yet try to contain Asia within itself, right? By saying something like, well, China remains primarily a regional power. On the flip side, if the US persists in identifying China as its primary peer competitor and its primary peer challenger, then the US may actually have to become less global in its strategic outlook and much more Asia-oriented if it's going to be going head-to-head with this peer competitor. So that kind of flips the imperatives in some ways. The US problem may then mainly become how it relates to Asia, not just Asian allies, while China, to ensure its continued prosperity because of its global political, economic embeddedness, must deal with how it deals with the rest of the world, not just Asia. So for that reason, I think that one has to think about China more explicitly within the global context. In the couple of minutes I have left, let me say a little about China and Japan, which Professor Womack foreshadowed that I might. I just add 2 points on that incredibly important relationship if you think about the East Asian security complex. I'm not sure that Japan's status nostalgia, as Professor Womack put it, is the overwhelming theme that comes across to me when I think about the Sino-Japanese relationship. Japan, I think, is in quite a different situation vis-a-vis China compared to where the US is vis-a-vis China. This is for historical, geographical, and also political economic reasons. I think the most important thing to keep in mind, perhaps, is that the Japanese have had more than a decade to deal with the fact that China has clearly surpassed Japan. Right? It was in 2010 when the Chinese economy overtook the Japanese economy. It's the second largest economy in the world. And at the time, this was a huge shock, but a very quick reckoning for Japanese leaders and Japanese people. And we see very significant reorientations of Japanese defense and strategic policy in that intervening decade. And so I think, the Japanese attitudes towards China is much more complex and much more multifaceted than we have time to go into here. But it suffice to say that I don't think Japan is simply an honorary Western nation that happens to be dislocated within Asia. Rather, Japan is an Asian power, albeit quite an unusual one. It has a civilizational and a shared history with China, the way that the United States never had and never will have. It is an Asian power, and it has been embedded in East Asia, especially since the 1970s. Again, the way, in a way that very few other nations have been. So while China certainly needs to get used to treating other countries with a greater degree of symmetry in its relationships, and could certainly learn to respect Japan again, and China has in recent past, including the 1950s and 1970s, had a great deal of respect for Japan for different reasons. It is also up to Japan to learn how to live with China again, including how to do so autonomously if necessary. Now, let me end by recommending and reinforcing the beautiful job that Professor Womack has done in this lecture of painting a picture of East Asia without rose tints, right? And perhaps I could support his idea that East Asia's future is not going to be necessarily a comfortable or a cozy one. In fact, it is not going to be a comfortable or cozy, and it's certainly not going to be comfortable or cozy for those who believe to the vision of a previous US-led liberal order in which the lamb lay down safely next to the tiger and the dragon and all was good, right? Strategists in East Asia, I think, have a lot less trouble with this quite realistic lack of tinting in that image. Strategists within the region do not start from some cozy idea that there was a beautiful pro-US status quo in the region, even as they recognize the centrality of the US role and its alliances over the last 30 years in this part of the world. I just end with a reminder that within the region of East Asia, despite the centrality of the US role over the last 30 years, there has been a great deal of discomfort, a lack of expectation of perpetual peace, a great deal of contestation, the sense of being post-colonial rule takers, but at the same time, with the very strong imperative of having to live as next door neighbors to China. And so this is what drives the pragmatic mindsets, right, in the region when facing the future, right, which has equal amounts of opportunity and peril in it. And in that context, thank you, Professor Womack, for an incredibly important intervention in the sets of strategic debates and concerns which animate the region today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Evelyn, very much for those very insightful comments. And now we like to move to the last part of this, probably the most important part of this event, the Q&A, which can be done either through the Q&A function, or those of you who are here can ask this question verbally. So Brantly, do you want to come up here to take questions? But I have already collected, there are few questions that are posed through the Q&A function. And those of you who want to ask questions in the audience, gather your thoughts. I would like to first, in a sense, synthesize the questions that have come up through the Zoom. And in fact, most of them are about economics. And that leads me to the question, starting with your focus on multinodal, the concept that is really center stage in today's lecture. And then Evelyn also commented on that. So what is a node? Is a node primarily economic? Because some of the questions speak to that. And also, if we are talking about multinodal, what sort of relationship we have between those nodes? The reason I ask that is because 2 or 3 of the questions are about whether China can actually, is it really serious about joining the CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on the for Trans-Pacific Partnership. So this leads to actually a bigger point, which I think we discussed, you and I discussed before. There's no question that China's economic power is growing, okay? Everybody agrees on that. But does it really get reflected on its institutional influence? So when you look at China, the region is increasingly dependent on China, as you said, in terms of economic trade relationship. But does it correspond with institutional arrangements? Can China really organize the region that reflects its growing economic cloud? Just look at the current situation. Well, China, of course, is the #1 economic power in Asia. But when it comes to institutions, they are ASEAN centered. The leader is ASEAN. When it comes to military, there is the United States. The United States has most of the alliances, even if you call them heritage. And when it comes to culture, don't forget Japan. In a recent opinion poll in Singapore, the country with the most soft power in Southeast Asia was Japan. If you go to popular culture in Southeast Asia, it's Korean soap opera, Indian movies. So we're seeing a situation that China is economically growing, more and more powerful, unable to institutionally organize this region. And maybe this region will be kind of have this built-in diversity where the United States remains the dominant military player, China dominant economic player, and ASEAN maybe remains central to the institutional architecture, and Japan has a lot of the soft power. How does that sort of fit into your multinodal concept? And also, specifically, could you comment on whether China is really serious about joining the CPTPP, or it's just a political game? That's one of the questions. So that's the opening question I'd like to ask you, drawing on what's on the screen here.
Well, thank you very much, Amitav, and thanks for synthesizing the questions too. Of course, I'm used to giving long answers to short questions. So maybe I should try giving a short answer to a long question, but I don't have a short answer to that question. But I'd like to point out that in conjunction with Evelyn's point about looking toward the future, we're looking at something that is radically contingent on leadership's decisions not yet made, et cetera. So it is not just a question of the ambiguity of cross-cutting levels of interaction, cultural, economic, political, military. It's also how these things are directed by the individual countries. So it is a mess. So now I am qualified to give a short answer to the question, which is, what is a node? And that is, a node is something so simple that it can be used in all of these complex situations. Basically, a node is a point of action in a network. That is a cross point, a decision point that can affect others in the network as well. So it's an interactive actor in a network. If you look at Google nodes, things of that sort, then it's not so active. But in the case of international nodes, I think each one's active. But are they equally active? Are they equally active in different spheres? No. If we were talking about culture, of course, we'd need somebody other than me because I'm not that cultured. But we'd have different nodes. K-pop, or the Japanese subsidizing and assisting of the development of cultural things in Southeast Asia and in other developing countries and in China. But the idea of a node as an intersection is important. And then in international relationships, the node and a nation as a node, a political community as a node, has different capacities, and its relationships with other places have different levels of exposure. And those levels of exposure, those differences in exposure, create differences in attention patterns. And I would say that international attention founded on exposure is the major characteristic of international nodes. And then we can divide those into economic exposures, political exposures, and security exposures. But I'm not sure if we have to, I would be careful to avoid assuming that something that is not institutionalized, especially in a novel situation, is not important. We're seeing an evolving situation, and to some extent you evolve from actions that work, actions that can be repeated, to habitual actions, to institutionalizing those actions. And this is something that for an era that, and I would start from 2008, there's a long way to go yet.
Thank you. So there are another question or two, but let me take one question from the floor now. Then I'll come back to the screen. Yes. You want to introduce yourself? I think it'll be good for the audience. And try to speak up because, you have the microphone.
Thank you, Professor Womack and Professor Gao. Yeah, so besides these economic questions that you've just answered, I'm also curious about the border issues. So you've talked about the relationship between China and Japan is the key relationship in the East Asia. But recently the relationship between China and Vietnam has, changed a lot. So the relationship between China and Vietnam has swung from friendly interactions to hostility in the past decade. And from the constructivism view that I just learned from Professor Shoba's IR class, the China and the Vietnam are the two largest communist states in the world. So I was wondering why did that happen, and the relationship between China and Vietnam will go to what kind of directions in the future, and also what kind of role the U.S. play in this change. So yeah, thank you again.
Very good. Well, now there's a tempting question for me. I have a book on China-Vietnam relations, and I could write another book as we talk on the subject. The relationship, in a word, is complex. There is, Vietnam knows that it does not have a choice in neighbors. And it also knows that the opportunities of its economy in many respects are connected to China. That's why it runs a very large trade deficit with China. And there's a much cooperation in this intermediate global value chains system between China and Vietnam. On the other hand, Vietnam culturally, its identity is defined as not necessarily opposed to China, but as distinct from China. The name Vietnam is the South Viets. So where are the North Viets? You know, it's an interesting question, that feeling of being to the South. And it's part of this asymmetric relationship between China and Vietnam that is true between China and all of its neighbors, although different to each neighbor. China and Vietnam were at war from 1979 to 1991. And so there's a recent memory of hostility, but also each side knows that they couldn't dominate the relationship, that ultimately China can't defeat Vietnam, and ultimately Vietnam needs China. So there are occasional imaginations in the United States that Vietnam can become the next member of the Quad, you know, and join an alliance in containing China. There would have to be a fundamental further deterioration in the Vietnam-China relationship for that to be a reasonable proposition on the Vietnamese side.
Okay, I now go back to the screen, and I do notice that Professor Chin Ya-Ching is here, one
Yes.
of my oldest friends in China, actually.
Yes.
Is Professor
Yes.
Chin, do you have anything to ask? I know you were a discussant in the previous session,
Yes,
so I will give the floor to you.
Thank you, Amitav.
Hey,
It's so nice to
Out of
see
my
you
world,
on
it's
the
like
screen, also
back
to
to the
see
history. Yeah.
all these friends here. In fact, I shared my idea with Brantly that the world will become multinodal, and also your idea, a multiplex world. But as I said last time, the nodal idea does not mean a traditional power concept. In this way, maybe I share to some extent Evelyn's idea about power. And this is the first point. The second point is that I quite agree. When we look at the world, maybe we can think about order transition. And maybe we can even think about, this is what I'm writing about in an article, a global societal transition. This goes beyond the human concerns. It's not completely a human world. It's a human, hyperhuman, and all these societies may mix together. But I do not want to go to details in this. This is especially important for global governance concerning climate change, environment management, and so on. When we have this idea, control, management, in fact, we have a human in the center already. The third point I want to make is that I'm so sorry to tell Brantly that in the program, they still write your title as multimodal. I think multinodal, they automatically change it into multimodal. I'm sorry for that, but I think multinodal, that is a really interesting concept to think about the world and even to think about how the world will be organized. Thank you very much, Amitav. So nice to see you here.
Good to see you.
So,
I can't wait to be back.
I think when the virus is gone, we can come together somewhere. I'm in Qingdao now. Thank you.
Yes, I'll be back in Beijing as soon as I can travel there.
Sure.
Brantly, do you want to respond to that in any way, or that you're okay with?
No, well, let me just say that I am delighted and relieved by the enthusiasm for the concept of multinodal. Not just because it's my concept, which is nice, but I think it's a more optimistic view of what the possibilities are in the world than one built simply on power and power rivalries. And I'm not in favor of unrealistic optimism, but I am in favor of avoiding self-fulfilling prophecies of misleading paradigms. And I think the paradigm of competing powers, the typical realist paradigm in international relations, is a misleading paradigm that can lead to unnecessary conflicts and lead to the ignoring of cooperative opportunities. And I'm hoping that something like multiplex or multinodal could contribute to a more sensitive interaction of countries of different levels of power.
Thank you. I will take a question now from, yes, from the room. Just hang on for the microphone.
Hello, thank you all very much for speaking this evening. It's been very, very enlightening, great stuff. My question is, do you guys foresee a possible neo-tribute system forming in the world between the United States and, say, the Western Hemisphere with South America and possibly with China and all of the Asian sphere, much like we had in sort of the old pre-industrialized period from the 12th to 15th century in Asia? Do you foresee that happening in this multinodal world as power centralizes around two sort of nodes and hegemony is established, but maybe it's just sort of a soft hegemony? Do you think this is possible? Do you think this is an interesting framework to look through it? Not useful at all? What are your thoughts?
I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, again, the whole point of this lecture series is rethinking the framework, rethinking the basics. And your question points out some very basic things to rethink. If the global midpoint of the economy is moving back, if there's a convergence in per capita productivity that's occurring, are we also moving to a world that there is less, where divergence is losing its privilege, and therefore that world should be built on something based more on mutual respect, and where the realism of this world is a realism that recognizes the necessity of cooperative relationships, not simply the maximizing of one's advantages in a particular decision or transaction. Well worth thinking about. There's certainly huge differences between now and the pre-modern world. So those would have to be taken into consideration. But as a metaphor, as something worth thinking about, what you're raising is certainly worth thinking about.
So we are, I don't know how long you want to continue, but we are almost end of the time. But I want to be a little mischievous and ask one question to three of you. So you, Brantly, Evelyn, our discussant, and of course, Yaching from Beijing. And this question really, to me, will be very important in deciding the fate of Asia, at least for the next decade or so. And that is the idea of the Indo-Pacific. Now, you use the term Pacific Asia, and I believe you had a conversation with Evelyn about this. So what does Indo-Pacific mean for the rise of China? And is it because the United States, of course, is putting a lot of resources behind Indo-Pacific, and it is geared towards, if not containing, but preventing China from dominating the region. So, and I think it has some support in Southeast Asia, although Southeast Asia, as usual, is divided. India is into Indo-Pacific. Australia is into Indo-Pacific, and now Britain is getting into it with the new agreement with the US and Australia. So I'd like to ask three of you, is Indo-Pacific just a temporary illusion, or will it really have a serious impact on China and its influence or its ability to organize the region? So I would like to ask this question. You can go in the end.
Well,
Evelyn, maybe you
very,
can,
very good. I'll go in.
you can answer this question first.
Yes, sir. I think the short answer I'll give to that is that, you know, in this ongoing order transition that we see in the region, there's obviously going to be a fair amount of discursive as well as policy debate on how we think about the region and what we determine the region to be. And so the Indo-Pacific in that context, I think, is one, as I've argued before, one of the three large competing, what I call strategic imaginaries in Asia today. The other two being, of course, the older Asia-Pacific imaginary, and then the other one being, you know, China's greater Asia sort of imaginary that it is forging through things like the BRI, which yet doesn't quite have a name that's suitable. So, you know, my take on this is that the Indo-Pacific idea is a very significant means of contesting what is the region and who is in legitimately, who is out, and primarily who has a right to project and to operate in Asia, the Asian security complex. I'll put a link in the chat box to that lecture for anyone who's interested. Brantly has seen it. Thank you. I'll turn over to Professor Qian. Thanks.
Okay, so, oh, sorry. I shouldn't have done that. Okay. Yaching, yeah, can you
Yes, sir.
have your
Thank
views
you
on
very
this?
much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This is a very interesting question, Amitav, because in China, there has been debate over this special term, Indo-Pacific. The original term is Asia-Pacific. When we look at the old discussion literature, we can almost always find the term is Asia-Pacific. Then we have the change. So why the change takes place? That's the question for the Chinese. I think from the Chinese perspective, first, this change implies some competition, especially competition vis-a-vis China. Second, it tries to reduce China's role in the region, because you do not use Asia-Pacific, use Indo-Pacific. You try to change, to reduce the role of China. Third, this is the most important part of the argument in China, and also most extreme argument, that is, this concept itself tries to contain China's growth. So you could form a kind of alliance system, especially you think about Quad. Last time I commented a little bit on this. So from the Chinese perspective, Indo-Pacific is more negative than positive. By the way, Amitav, I'm in Qingdao. I'm far from Beijing. Thank you.
Oh, you're in Qingdao. Okay. Okay, so Brantly, this is a very important question, because if you're talking about multinodal,
right,
nobody dominates, and the traditional power politics
right,
kind of changes. Then you have Indo-Pacific, which the Chinese think is a way of containing them. So what does that say about the idea of multinodal?
Well, first of all, I think that if China sees its relationship to Pacific Asia as an exclusive relationship, that's its zone, and it has a sort of Monroe Doctrine for Pacific Asia, and Indo-Pacific is trying to contain China's zone, then I think that it's a short-sighted view on China's part. Of course, China is the largest trading partner of all of the members of the Quad, so it's not isolated by the Indo-Pacific. That the idea of of the motivation, the American motivation for Indo-Pacific being an attempt to box in China. I don't think that's unreasonable. I think that was the original idea for the TPP when the United States supported it. How does this work? You know, what should China do about this? Should it respond in a sort of tit for tat way? I'd say no. It should respond by continuing its relationships as best it can with India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, and thereby expand their influence. And to use the Chinese phrase, let the United States lift the rock to drop it on its own toes.
Okay, what's the situation in terms of timing? We are past the time, I believe.
Well,
But shall we take another one or two questions? It's totally up to you.
well, I think the
stop
first
here.
thing we should do is be merciful to the audience.
Yes.
And so
I
I
think,
think we probably should stop. But
So again, sorry about those who had questions and couldn't get a chance to ask them. But again, thank you very much, Brantly, for sharing your views. This is the last of your 4
yes,
lectures, so you're all set for your book.
hope
That's the hard part. But thank you for inviting me to moderate the session. And thank you, everybody in the room and around the world for listening in and asking questions, those of you who got the chance. So we will now end the session. Thank you very much.
Well, let me say one thing, and that
yeah,
is
you
my
have to-
thank yous. First of all, thank you to you, Amitav, for coming all the way from Washington through the traffic that many of us know in the Beltway to Charlottesville. And I hope this will be the first of many visits. And secondly, thank you to Chinaching and Evelyn and everybody that has participated and thought seriously about this project and contributed your own brilliant ideas to the project. It will really add a depth and texture to a book. And last and certainly not least, thank you to the East Asia Center and to Dorothy Wong especially, but also Brian Murphy, wherever, there he is, the guy that makes everything work. And again, to you guys for showing up to this late night lecture, and for some of you for the 4th time. And thanks to the Zoom audience and the YouTube audience, and if you're listening to this on a recording, thanks to you too. And let's call it a night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yaching, I'll hope to see you. I'm hoping to go back to Beijing in February to Schwarzman again. And I'm giving the keynote to Beijing Forum in 2 weeks.
I see, but I will not be.
I know
part
you
of
are in
the
Qingdao,
report.
so I wish I
I'm
was
sorry
there.
for that.
Yeah.
But it's so nice
I will
to.
visit you in Qingdao, okay?
Okay, sure.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Evelyn.
Evelyn,
Great.
good to see you.
You're very welcome, and
Thank you
nice
very
to
much,
see
Yaching.
everybody. Yeah.
Yushan. Great job.
Take care.